will take place later today. The next item on our agenda is the human rights situation in Kazakhstan. Rosa Thun-Hohenstein has the floor and she will be speaking from Warsaw. 3 minutes.
Colleagues, Commissioner, Kazakhstan government intends to celebrate the 30th anniversary of independence, but it will not be a real celebration until all political prisoners are released, until politically motivated court proceedings are not dropped, as well as all kinds of harassment aimed at regime critics, human rights defenders and civil society activists, until all this is not stopped. But unfortunately, these are the common practices in today's Kazakhstan. A year ago, I visited Kazakhstan to discuss the implementation of Kazakhstan's human rights obligations stemming from Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. It was during this very visit that Dulat Agadil, a blogger and a prominent human rights activist, died in a pre-trial detention facility. Died, or was he killed? I saw pictures and films from his brutal deportation from home. I saw pictures and films showing his death, the dead body, with traces of torture. I heard that he was denied medical aid and he died only several hours after his detention. I asked at several meetings with the authorities what happened, and until today nobody received a serious response. Those films were made by his son, Jean Bolat. A few months later, Jean Bolat, 17 years old and the main witness of Dulat's arbitrary arrest, was murdered in suspicious circumstances. Those also have not been properly investigated. Only in 2020, 3 more opposition activists, Sherik Orazov, Anambike Kairola, and Garifula Embergenov, lost lives after being put under immense political pressure. The authorities obstruct fair and transparent investigation into these deaths, and none of the perpetrators has been brought to justice. Yes, we hear and we welcome the release from prisons of certain opposition leaders. And we welcome cancellation of fines that had been unjustly put on NGOs, but we cannot accept imposing bans on their activism, and unacceptable are practices of constant pressure on civil society organizations. Opposition movements, human rights activists are labeled extremist organizations and treated as such. We elaborate more on this in our resolution. I want to very sincerely thank all of you colleagues and our wonderful staff members who cooperated on it. And I want to appeal to you all. I want to urge also all our EU institutions to strengthen Kazakhstan's civil society, raising concerns with the authorities and even considering the imposition of targeted sanctions against state officials linked to human rights abuses, including the political killings. I wanted to add the last sentence because, as we are talking now, at least 17 supporters of peaceful opposition movements risk sharing the fate of Dulat Agadil if not immediately released from prisons. Their names are Ashkat Zhakeshbayev and Kairat Klyshev. Meanwhile, others like DCK activist Almat Zhumagulov, Aset Abishev and Kenshebek Abishev
Dziękuję bardzo, pani poseł.
long prison sentences, free for political prisoners. Thank you very much. Dziękuję, pani przewodnicząca.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani poseł. Z biura w Rydze głos zabierze.
Thank you very much. Now from Riga, we have Mr. AMERIKS for 3 minutes.
Dear colleagues, Honorable Chair, I would like to start by saying that Kazakhstan is a very important partner to the EU, and relationship with Kazakhstan as one of the guarantors of stability and development in the region of Central Asia is very important. We highly appreciate the reforms carried out in public administration and legislation, including by abolishing death penalty. It is therefore that for an important partner that we have, our friend, it is important to express our criticism, our concerns about human rights being observed and respected. It is already for 1 year that the Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and Kazakhstan is in effect, aimed at providing broad basis for a strengthened political dialogue with significant role devoted to democracy, rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms. Our common goal is the well-being of citizens and democracy. Today we will vote on a resolution about human rights violations in Kazakhstan. How has this issue come into our agenda? Starting in August last year, up to the end of the year, in several regions of Kazakhstan, without sufficient reason and evidence, the authorities started cracking down on civil society organizations, starting checks on the donations from abroad received by these organizations and how this money was spent. Altogether, for more than 20 such NGOs, procedures were started. Some of them received large fines. Several of them were forced to cease their operations. Such activities by the Kazakhstan authorities attracted the attention of the international society, including that of the European Union, and we had to act. I asked the government of Kazakhstan to observe the commitments, the international commitments that they have entered into, respect the human rights and fundamental freedoms. I also asked Kazakhstan to implement reforms aimed at promoting modernization of the country, democracy and stability in the country, as well as strengthen the efforts in reforming the political system, promoting parliamentarism and multi-party system, promoting also civil participation. I would like to stress once again that Kazakhstan is a close and trustworthy partner of Europe in the Central Asia region, and the friendship between Europe and Kazakhstan allows to ensure higher safety in the region and a clear future for the inhabitants of the country. But there are things that need to be improved in cooperation with the EU institutions and that of the European Parliament. I find it sympathetic, the efforts of Kazakhstan to strengthen its democratic process, and I consider them my friends. So this resolution will serve as a roadmap to the partnership.
Zabierze pan poseł Petras, AUŠTREVIČIUS.
Thank you very much. Mr. Petras AUŠTREVIČIUS for 3 minutes.
Madam Chair, Mr. Commissioner, dear colleagues, Kazakhstan ranks 157th in the World Press Freedom Index. The state control over the freedom of speech in modernizing and moves on online space, seeking to censor and control internet. Bloggers, opinion makers and social media users are being silenced with long-term prison sentences and confinement to psychiatric clinics. Corruption among ruling elites prevails. The country ranks 94th in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index and further impedes the human rights, social justice and social economic development. Despite Kazakh authorities' promise to improve the human rights record under the Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement with the EU, despite acceptance of more than 200 recommendations provided by the UN Human Rights Council, and despite long-standing OSCE ODIHR recommendations and recent findings of the ODIHR Limited Election Observation Mission, the human rights violations in Kazakhstan are taking place on a daily basis. We are alerted and deeply concerned about the shrinking space of civil society, particularly the cases of several human rights organisations. Those activities were suspended and fined on alleged violations, and the crackdown against the independent trade unions. Even more worrisome situation is with peaceful opposition movements, Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan and Koše Partiasi, as their members and supporters dominate the list of political prisoners. Last year, 5 political activists, including Dulat Agadil and his 17-year-old son, have died as a result of illegal actions and political repression by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Human rights defenders in Kazakhstan are under constant intimidation, harassment and threat of criminal charges. For example, Elena Semenova is being persecuted for exposing torture in prisons. Raigul Sadirbayeva for helping activists to defend their rights. Anna Shukeeva and her husband Burzan Aturbayev for aiding politically prosecuted persons. Recent actions of Kazakh government, when few political prisoners were released, the fines and suspension of activities for several NGOs were removed, is much welcome, but does not fulfil its commitments. It must be clear that the European Union seeks for cooperation with Kazakhstan, but puts respect for human rights and democracy above economic gains. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie pośle. Głos zabierze pani.
Thank you very much. Ms. von CRAMON-TAUBADEL is next for 2 minutes.
Madam President, colleagues, Commissioner, 30 years ago, when Kazakhstan, as the last remaining Soviet republic, declared independence and effectively ended the Union, the hope was high that the new republic would embrace democracy and build an effective statehood. The hope was high that people of Kazakhstan who suffered on the nuclear site in Semipalatinsk would now be granted fundamental rights and a chance for a dignified life. All these hopes were crushed by 30 years of Nazarbayev's dictatorship. Not a single fair election was held under his rule. Corruption flourished, freedom of speech was severely restricted, opposition imprisoned, protests of mine workers brutally suppressed, and journalists terrorized and murdered. Now, Nazarbayev's successor promised to do a better job in controlled democratization. At one glance, party registration has been simplified, participation in protests partially allowed, death penalty was recently abolished, and regions were given a bit more of self-governance. Yet, the recent deterioration of human rights questions the real efforts of the new president. The key OSCE recommendations were ignored during the last parliamentary elections. Censorship was tightened and internet surveillance reached dystopian level. Hundreds of peaceful protesters were illegally detained. The practice of harassing, assaulting and arresting of journalists was continued. Women and girls still suffer greatly despite introduction of mandatory quotas on electoral lists. Not to speak about the terrible situation for women in detention centres. The government cracked down on the civil sector, trade unions and human rights organisations. Prisoners are still being tortured and the number of political prisoners started to rise again. The EU is based on the respect of fundamental rights and principles. Therefore, the economic cooperation with Kazakhstan, which has a huge potential, can only be advanced on condition of respecting our fundamental values. Human rights are not for sale. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani poseł. Głos zabierze pani poseł Malin.
Thank you very much. Ms. BJÖRK now for 2.5 minutes.
Dear colleagues, there are certain things that should be universal in this world. Respect for democracy, fundamental rights, and rule of law. And some of us fight relentlessly for this within the EU. And so that is why we also have to act when human rights and democracy is not respected outside the EU, as is the case today in Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, NGOs are harassed and silenced, human rights activists are imprisoned, the peaceful opposition movements are banned. The elections did not meet democratic standards. The authorities imprison individuals on politically motivated charges. They abuse legislation against extremism to call people into defamation and calling them terrorists, and also imprisoning. And the situation with ongoing torture has been documented. So, because of their very activities, their democratic activities, journalists, politicians, peaceful protesters, bloggers and human rights defenders, civil society is being targeted. And this situation cannot go on. With this resolution, we want to send a clear message, urging the authorities to stop all types of persecution of dissident voices and to release all political prisoners immediately. In today's debate, I also want to show our solidarity with our sisters in Kazakhstan who fight every day for the right to live a decent life free from violence. Last year's Women's March was the biggest one in Kazakhstan's independent history. And the women that gathered, they had a manifesto, and I quote, "We have the experience of living in a country where we do not feel safe and where the laws do not protect us. Security is the basic need of every person, and it's precisely what we are deprived of," the women's activists wrote. So I want to speak up in solidarity with our sisters who fall victims of gender-based violence and urge Kazakhstan to sign the Istanbul Convention, just as I urge those member states in the EU that haven't signed the Istanbul Convention to do so. We call for Kazakhstan to adopt robust legislation against violence against women, against gender-based violence, to protect the rights of those that need it most in a situation when we have not full respect for democracy and rule of law. So feminists around Europe, we stand with women's rights activists in Kazakhstan to speak up against impunity of those perpetrators of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo pani poseł. Głos zabierze pan poseł Thierry Mariani. Czas wystąpienia 2 minuty.
Thierry Mariani next for 2 minutes.
Il y a 29 ans.
29 years ago, Kazakhstan became an independent state. In those 29 years, this country has become a developed country open to the world with peaceful cohabitation of different nationalities. Could things be improved there? Yes, obviously, but in 29 years there's been such a peaceful development that it must be noted. There's been significant progress in human rights. President Tokayev continues with the opening up policy and has recently announced reforms which increase freedoms following measures already taken over recent years. Clearly, there is still progress to be made. The Kazakh authorities admit that themselves. What does this resolution actually do? It unjustly attacks one of the Asian republics, which is an example in the region. It sends a disgusting signal to other countries in the region, such as Uzbekistan. Moreover, this resolution already supports Mr. Azizbilyavov. He is a fraud. He is accused of embezzlement of 6 billion. He is accused of, and also he is accused of murder. He has been sentenced in UK and is sought in many other countries around the world. However, this individual is calling himself a human rights defender and is funding a range of different NGOs around the world. In 1993, following President Nazarbayev's future program, he has sent thousands of students to study in European US students. Do you really think that's a sign of a government which is closed to itself? This resolution and voting for this resolution is a vote against a country which is on the path to economic and democratic progress.
Thank
you very much. On behalf of the EPP group, we'll hear from Seán Kelly, speaking from the office in Dublin.
The deterioration of human rights in Kazakhstan is cause for deep concern. In the past few weeks, there has been a crackdown on civil society organisations. Harsh restrictions on the rights to peaceful assembly and association have also been imposed. The elections on the 10th of January did not demonstrate sufficient political reforms or any sort of democratic modernisation. Despite promises of the inclusion of genuine opposition parties to participate in the political system, no such parties were registered and allowed on the ballot, though several tried. This follows a slew of barriers and blockages to opposition, leaving many people without a voice. The state of media freedom is also worrying. State-owned or state-subsidised media channels dominate the Kazakhstani media, since the main national opposition newspapers were all banned in 2016. Independent journalists continue to face harassment. Regrettably, gender equality also remains a problem in Kazakhstan. Violence against women is vastly underreported, and LGBTI persons still face legal challenges and discrimination. More must be done to ensure the protection of the victims of gender-based violence. I urge the government of Kazakhstan to fulfil its domestic and international duties by stop attacking civil society and provide a culture of open government that empowers citizens. Nothing less will suffice.
Thank you very much, President, and all my best to my colleague for having spoken on this very important topic.
Bardzo, panie pośle, dziękuję bardzo w imieniu grupy
Thank you very much. Now on behalf of the S&D group, Mr. Sánchez AMOR.
Gracias,
Thank you, Madam President. I will not insist on the description that my colleagues have made, that I do have to disagree with my colleague Mr. Mariani, which has described the Kazakhstan, which is very different to others have said. We are seeing a black hole with human rights here. There's rhetoric which says that they want reform in Kazakhstan. However, they always focus on economic development and then what they call controlled democratization. The rate of democracy can be seen in elections which were not competitive, undemocratic elections. There's no transparency. There's ongoing pressure on trade unions and NGOs. There's also complicity with China and the pressure on the Uyghur. Now, asking what is our delegation doing in Kazakhstan? The EU delegation in Kazakhstan should ensure that the cooperation agreement includes human rights. Commissioner, we have received complaints about the attitude of our delegation in Kazakhstan. Apparently they practice silent diplomacy. That we need to have an opera singer in that delegation. We need someone to speak up given the human rights situation. If the delegation does not respond to pressure from the NGOs in it, then we need to send a real voice there.
W imieniu grupy Renew Europe głos zabierze Klemen.
Thank you very much. And now on behalf of the Renew Europe group, Mr. GROŠELJ. 2 minutes.
Must be, even if it wishes to be a geopolitical one, based on respect of fundamental rights and universally respected human rights. Respect and implementation of fundamental rights enshrined in the foundation of the EU are and need to be our main geopolitical tool in dealing with not democratic regime. It is proven that they are unable to efficiently fight the ideas promoted by our fundamental rights. They can and are using violence, suppression and all forms of coercion to confront these ideas, but they ultimately fail. In a world of great competition, the promotion of these values sometimes proves to be challenging. But with our economic power combined with credible military deterrence, we can succeed on both the global and regional level. We are faced with the rise of authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes in our neighbourhood, and Kazakhstan is unfortunately one of them. It is one of the countries in which the transition to democratic society failed not yesterday but years ago. What we are seeing now is the sliding of the country into an increasingly authoritarian reign, And Central Asia, which is of strategic importance to the EU, is witnessing in parallel with the rise of China also a rise of authoritarianism. This authoritarianism is based rather than on use of brutal force on the use of sophisticated technologies for mass control of people's everyday life. But we don't need to fill ourselves with illusions. If needed, brutal force is still at the regime disposal, and if needed, it will use it without any mercy. But in Kazakhstan, as a country at the crossroads of Western and Eastern influence, the regime also uses proven methods of opposition suppression, which are part of well-known arsenal of illiberal democracies. Full control of media, suppression of independent media, internet control and fake news dissemination, as well as scores of legal and administrative tricks to rig and manipulate election process. All this is done to portray to the world the Potemkin mirage of democratic society. In the long run, the suppression of democratic hopes cannot withstand the call for freedom and democracy. For this, I urge Kazakhstan authorities to release all political prisoners and start a process of democratization of the country and society, and by this ensure stability and prosperity for all people of Kazakhstan. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie pośle. W imieniu Grupy Tożsamość i Demokracja.
Thank you very much. And now on behalf of the ID group, the next speaker will be Mr. KRAH for 3 minutes.
Frau Präsidentin,
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, well, this is another example of a country that is trying to develop but is being lectured by Europe. Kazakhstan is a model of success in Central Asia. It's the country with the best economic performance. It's the country where there are the greatest freedoms and where it is making the transition into the modern age. Yes, it still has some way to go, but this country doesn't deserve to be lectured. It certainly doesn't deserve to be lectured on the basis of lobbying work on behalf of Mr. Yusov, who in this parliament has carried out a number of different events. Now, I have got a list from the research service as to the number of events held by the Open Dialogue Foundation here in the European Parliament. Well, it seems that the current trend is for millionaire philanthropists are actually using it as cover to pursue their economic interests. This is a man who had his had someone murdered as a bank director and has been sentenced. He's been sentenced in Britain and he's been prosecuted in France too. His organisation is freely invited here. Today's resolution is a result of that lobbying work. Look at letter T on that resolution. He is mentioned by name, and it's suggested that the Kazakh justice system has sentenced him for political reasons, but that's not correct. He was sentenced because of a murder, the assassination of a bank leader. Well, this is someone who's supposed to be a billionaire philanthropist that's a good person, but no, this is a criminal trial that's being sold as a political trial. So I think that we've got to be very careful about this. This is a sentenced criminal and is trying to get his own way. Kazakhstan has a long road ahead of it, but it is a country that is developing. We have about 800,000 Kazakh immigrants in my own country. There's a stable minority group, and we have about 200 German companies in Kazakhstan. Well, are we trying to prevent people from Kazakhstan leaving and seeing the world? Well, the best way to open your eyes and become more tolerant is to see the world. We need to look at the facts and look at reality. It doesn't fit in with the values imperialism and the human rights imperialism that we practice here. But it is shameful, and we have to apologize for the idea that this can be European policy. Thank you very much. And now on behalf of the Greens group, Mrs. HAUTALA will be speaking for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, after 30 years in power, President Nursultan Nazarbayev resigned in March 2019. Despite very high expectations, the respect for the rule of law, human rights and democracy remains weak. It's a reverse tendency in neighbouring Uzbekistan, by the way. President Tokayev is personally and directly responsible for the persecution of the civil society, mass detentions, silencing of critics, harassment of opposition members, and again on 10th of January, unfair and unfree parliamentary elections. And can I quote High Representative Borrell? He said, systemic shortcomings in relation to freedom of association, assembly and expression continue to restrict the political landscape, and the lack of competition left voters without a genuine choice. So Kazakhstan and the people of Kazakhstan are a partner to the EU, but it's time that the EU holds Kazakhstan's leaders to account. We do have the new global human rights sanctions regime. Let's use it.
Bardzo dziękuję. W imieniu Grupy Europejscy Konserwatyści.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the ECR group, I will give the floor to Mrs. Mazurek. 1 minute.
Pani Przewodnicząca, Panie Komisarzu, Szanowni Państwo.
Madam President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, the activities we see from Kazakhstan in the area of human rights need to be properly assessed. There is some progress, but there is room for more improvement. We want to ensure that Kazakh citizens can enjoy their full rights, that there is freedom of religion guaranteed as well. We want to promote democracy as well. So it's important that dialogue with Kazakhstan continues. We want to ensure that the standards of international organizations are...
Thank you very much. Now on behalf of the non-attached members, Mr. Castaldo, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues. On the 1st of March 2020, the Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement was signed with Kazakhstan, and that hopefully will be a turning point in the development of this Asian country. The parliamentary elections are an important missed opportunity. It's not enough to simply follow the forms, but we need substance. This vote has been marked by serious and persistent problems, targeted and politically motivated arrests, and pervasive corruption with candidates threatened. Special courts, secret sentences, indefinite preventative incarceration, restrictions on freedom of expression, restrictions on bloggers, religious leaders, journalists. Well, we've got a big problem here. In 2019, we recognise the importance of our strategic relation with the region, but of course, this all has to be done with full respect for the rule of law. We've got instruments in our hands, our trade policy and our global sanctions regime. We need to impose these when necessary. That can give a voice to those who do not have one. Otherwise, our voice will lose significance. Thank you.
Dziękuję. Bardzo proszę o zabranie głosu panią poseł Isabel Wiseler-Lima.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mrs. Wiseler-Lima for 1 minute.
Merci, Madame la Commissaire.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner. Madam President. Commissioner, the situation of Kazakhstan and human rights is not a new one. However, it constitutes an urgency for us today because the situation in recent weeks has got even worse, with increased repression on civil society and severe restrictions imposed on freedom of expression. The organisations for defending human rights in Kazakhstan have been subject to repression and increasing sanctions from the authorities, and a number of journalists are being persecuted. While in the European Union we have all the more responsibility not to be silent given this slippage, because we have signed a partnership agreement with Kazakhstan, the EPCA, which came into force in March last year. This agreement considers that there are closer ties between us There's an agreement, there's cooperation, that Kazakhstan has entered into agreements to go through with serious reforms. We in this Assembly believe that Kazakhstan has to keep these promises vis-à-vis the European Union. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję, pani poseł.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Mr. HAJŠEL, for 1.5 minutes. He will be connecting with us from the Bratislava office.
30 years following gaining the independence, the Kazakhstani society has been changing a lot. The last positive signal was announced intention to abolish the death penalty for all crimes. However, the ongoing crackdown on local human rights groups and the persecution of the human rights activists has provoked serious concerns whether Kazakhstan's leadership is genuinely interested in improving its human rights record. According to human rights groups, coordinated actions and unlawful acts are limiting fundamental rights and freedoms. We also have to be very cautious that the context of COVID-19 pandemic is not used as a pretext for further escalation of the situation. Such doubts are damaging Kazakhstan's international reputation, and the EU needs to indicate this to Kazakhstan's authorities clearly, as we have joint partnership agreement with this Central Asian country. The EU should act consistently towards any ongoing and long-standing threats towards citizens' fundamental rights, both within and beyond our external borders, and Kazakhstan cannot be any exceptions. Thank you very much.
Köszönöm szépen. És a következő hozzászóló.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Ždanuka on behalf of the Greens.
Honourable colleagues, as a member of Central Asia delegation and former vice chair of it, I am for mutually respectful, equal dialogue with Kazakhstan. I sharply condemn violation of rights and freedoms elsewhere in the world, including Kazakhstan. This country has a lot to do to put an end to human rights abuses. But we have to fight for freedoms together. The EU as it is now is not suitable for the role of a judge for third countries in human rights matters. In my country, Latvia, non-citizens making 10% of population will have no rights to take part in forthcoming local elections. Recently, 7 journalists, Alla Berezovskaya and the others, were charged with a criminal offence just for the fact of working for certain media. In neighbouring Lithuania, former MP Algirdas Paleckis is persecuted for his opinion just descending from the official one. In Spain, former MEPs Oriol Junqueras and Raúl Romeva are imprisoned. So I propose the following question to my colleagues. Do we have the moral right to teach Kazakhstan on democracy and the rule of law, human rights, fundamental freedoms, while we ourselves behave badly in the very same area?
Thank you.
Jó, most működik a mikrofon.
Now it works. Next speaker is Ms. Kruk for the ECR.
Pani Przewodnicząca, o złej...
Madam President, bad situation of human rights in Kazakhstan is something we've been known for many years, limiting basic freedoms such as freedom of expression or religion. OECD was also talking about problems with elections, which did not respect the right to free expression and political freedoms. We had arrests and the elections, in the elections, opposition parties could not participate, so only government parties in the end were elected. There are also other examples of persecutions, also by fiscal authorities and administrative authorities. The government has announced reforms including priority treatment for human rights. But we should be very cautious. We should monitor the process, including concerning the elections. Thank you.
Következő hozzászóló Rukmek.
Thank you. The next speaker is Dorian Rukmaker, a non-attached member.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commissioner. The abuse of human rights is immoral, and it leads to an increase in migration streams, to the economic detriment and political instability of the area. If you are left-wing or right-wing, from whatever point of view you have, this is moral and rational to take the right choice. Now, in Kazakhstan, I have my doubts as to whether we need to provide financial support. This is money that has been garnered from the European citizens, and we have to watch very closely that it is spent properly. Clear results have no prospects. We have no expectations that that will happen. The recent geopolitical threats from Russia may mean that this is not something we want to put on the back burner. So I'd ask the Commission to change course and strengthen the position of women in Kazakhstan instead. It's only from that angle that we can expect any light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Ninas for the Greens.
Ladies and gentlemen, actually, I wanted to respond to Mr. KRAH, who just left, which is great. But last year we were in Kazakhstan. Exactly 1 year ago, the delegation for Central Asia went to Kazakhstan, and we looked at everything there, and we met with officials there, and we actually asked how are the reforms going. They were shown to us, and it's great to see that there were reforms and that they're undergoing, and we support this. We want to see more of that, and we are thankful that the government is going in this direction. But at the same time, we also really had to demand a meeting with human rights defenders and with the civil society, and the only place where we could actually meet them was on neutral ground, which was the EU embassy there, and that was devastating for me. We talked to them, and on the day we left, one person died in prison, and others that we just talked to were imprisoned the very day we sat in the flight back. And that is the instance where we criticize as the European Union the question of human rights. And dear government of Kazakhstan, if you want us to not publish resolutions like these, it's very easy, follow human rights. One last thing I want to mention to Mr. Mariani, Mr. KRAH, and especially Mr. Martuchello, who is the chair of the EU delegation for Kazakhstan. You are there to represent EU values, not your own personal profits. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now on behalf of the Commissioner Nicola Schmidt will respond to the issues raised here.
Madam President, honourable members, in March 2020, the EU-Kazakhstan Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement entered into force, providing us with a framework for advancing cooperation on human rights, rule of law, and with civil society. Last November, the EU and Kazakhstan held a human rights dialogue and a subcommittee on justice and home affairs. Although the pandemic is challenging for governments, the EU recalled that any restrictive measure must be legitimate and proportionate, limited in time, non-discriminatory, transparent, and should not hamper the effective exercise and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, or compromise them in the long term. The importance of an independent judiciary, media freedom, freedom of expression, and freedom of association and peaceful assembly, zero tolerance to torture, and independent monitoring of detention facilities were also discussed. The EU welcomed the decriminalisation of defamation, the abolition of the death penalty, and continued efforts to tackle torture and improve detention conditions in prisons. We remain concerned about reports that activists, bloggers and journalists are increasingly charged of knowingly disseminating so-called false information, which can lead to sentences of imprisonment of up to 7 years. We are also concerned that the offences of insult and insulting a government representative remain subject to criminal penalty. Last week, the EU welcomed the decision of the Kazakh authorities to drop all charges against some prominent human rights NGOs that had received fines and a suspension of their activity based on unclear legal grounds. The EU encourages the Kazakh government to create an enabling environment for civil society to flourish, which is in the best interest of the country on its path to reform. Following the parliamentary elections in January, the EU expressed regrets in relation to the limitations on fundamental freedoms, including the detention of peaceful demonstrators and concerted measures which prevented some domestic election observers from effective observation. It is important that Kazakhstan continues to take steps to foster an enabling environment for civil society, human rights defenders, lawyers, trade unionists and journalists. Lastly, the High Representative welcomes Kazakhstan's follow-up to individual cases raised by the EU. In the framework of our enhanced partnership and cooperation agreement, the EU will continue to support Kazakhstan in its reform and modernisation efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Now this brings our debate to an end.